and welcome to the podcast where friends discuss environmental policies from around the planet.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Planet Policy Pals podcast. I'm Ajwa, and I'm joined here with my fellow co-host, Ala.
Hey!
Hey girl, and we are joined here again with a new guest for this series. We are here with Miss Risham Amjad, who is a friend of mine actually, but is also a badass when it comes to the climate world, especially policy. Hey girl, how are you?
Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. We are really excited. This is so nice. Thank you for coming on our show. We already had two people talk about Nigeria, so we had to balance it out with Pakistan. We have a lot of Pakistani followers. I don't want them to hate me.
Well, welcome back, guys. We really hope they're going to enjoy this episode as well. Please keep reviewing us, please keep rating us, and please keep following us on social media. We are on Twitter at Planet Policy Pal, Instagram at Planet Policy Pals, and we are also on Facebook under Planet Policy Pals podcast name. So please, we need your support. So please keep supporting us. But before we get into this episode, let's talk about Newsly. Newsly is a revolutionary app that lets you listen to news, podcasts, and pretty much the internet all on one app. Everything from sports to science to Bitcoin and pop culture is available, and it reads to you. They have trending podcasts from over 50 countries, including us, of course, because we're amazing. So you have even more ways to hear our lovely voices.
Yeah, and as Ajwa has said many, many times, we do not get paid for this. I love this app. We use it because I love reading news, and now I can hear it. Browse from tons of topics and start listening today by heading to newsly.me and use promo code PLANETPALS to receive a 1-month free premium subscription courtesy of the awesome Newsly team. We'll also link that in the description, and the code is on our website as well. That is newsly.me, and promo code is PLANETPALS. Rest your eyes, gain some knowledge, you guys.
Yeah, like some actual knowledge. That's not memes. Anyway, today we are talking about the climate crisis in developing countries, and also like Allah already gave us the spoiler, in Pakistan especially. So of course the weather is changing, guys. Climate is changing. It's so hot, and I'm literally boiling right now because I have to record this without a fan. Why is that? We literally woke up one day in March and realized it's June weather, and none of us was prepared.
Nobody was ready.
And not just that, we've seen changes in monsoon and increased temperatures, which are likely to bring, obviously, considerable changes to the agriculture sector, which is what Risham is here to talk about, especially in northern Pakistan. Now, the vulnerability in this area is really high, and rises in the annual maximum and minimum temperatures are projected to be stronger than the rise in average temperature. So it amplifies the pressure on human health, livelihoods, and ecosystem. Right now, most of the arable land is already in use, which means we need to have smarter investments so that we can ensure a stable food supply in this dynamic economy in this phase of climate change.
Yeah, especially when you think about the fact that in countries where most of the population lives in poverty, extreme weather can be a devastating blow. I believe we've talked about that multiple times on this show. So individuals that don't have a lot of savings to rebuild, and when governments don't have a lot of resources, of course you're going to have people struggling to secure the money that's necessary for recovery after a natural disaster or an environmental disaster. Some countries are being hit by back-to-back disasters, especially in recent times. In 2015, right, the Caribbean island nation of Dominica was hit by Tropical Storm Erica, and this caused about $400 million in damage. And that equaled 90% of the country's GDP.
Wow.
2 years later, they had to deal with Hurricane Maria, and that was horrible as well, and it damaged 90% of the country's housing stock. So if you put that in context, they're dealing with this back-to-back, they don't even have time to recover, and it's taking up so much of their money. In the Gambia, in West Africa, most people live in rural areas, and it's a country that relies heavily on agriculture. So when they have crop failures, it's catastrophic. Because the country's main river flows into the ocean, rising sea levels are pushing salt water farther and farther upriver, which makes it hard to get fresh water. And this reminds me very much of a place like Pakistan. So that is why we have Risham on here. Of course, you know, we always talk about science and stuff on the show, but we also have to look at the money side of the climate. So Risham, we know that you studied economics for your undergraduates. Could never be us. So thank God somebody else is here doing it. And then
For real.
we only do enough economics to tell you cost benefit analysis for an engineering project. The end. And then you went on to study urban planning and policy, which is amazing. And now you work in environmental policy consultancy in Pakistan. So how does your background in economics aid your work in climate policy?
So that's a super interesting question, and thank you guys for the lovely and warm introduction. I think that a background in econ is really is like a foundational thing because it gives you analytical skills. It gives you the ability to understand micro and macro changes in economics, which in the economic policy of a country, which you can translate to anything and specifically to environmental policy, because figuring out the financials of environmental damage and figuring out where that money is coming from or which sectors of the economy it's hitting is super, super important and a huge part of measuring impact measurement metrics. So I think my background in economics just sort of gave me some of those data analysis tools, some of that macro and micro kind of like viewpoints into the economy. But other than that, I don't know, it was a bit of a wash, really. Wait, econ is good. Wait. Econ is good, guys. I think a background in economics is definitely helpful because it's a background in social sciences, and econ is one of those like backbone social sciences, and you can take it in so many different places. I have friends who did my degree with me that are working in nutrition. Others are working in tech. Still others are working in international security policy, gendered policy. I'm working in environment policy. So it really is one of those things. It's like a math degree. Theoretically, you could do anything with it.
There you go. I know sometimes we have younger people who listen to this show. It's rare, but they listen. We're getting the Gen Zs, guys. So if you guys are wondering what to study, there's econ. You could be cool one day. Not as cool as me, but you know.
You can try.
You could try. So as somebody who has been researching Pakistan's climate vulnerability for a while now, what would you say professionally has been the most significant challenge that you faced during that time?
So I think one of the challenges that I faced even when I was a grad student researching Pakistan, because that's always been what's guided the thread through all my research ever since I was an undergrad, has been a lack of data. I think that climate models and adaptation specific data for impact metrics is hard to find anyway, and we're still sort of developing those tools at the moment. There are some Pakistan specific data lags. For example, our last census was in 2017. That was our population census. Our last agriculture census was, I believe, in 2010 or 2012. So some of the data that we're just working on specific to the ag sector is just based on estimates from a long time ago. And of course, they do use proxies and they do sort of make adjustments, but there's no beating going out in the field and doing that kind of data collection. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is the fact that I am a person that comes from an urban area and I have a lot of privilege. And the work that I do is centered in rural areas. It's the farmers, it's the small and specifically smallholder farmers who are some of the most poor and some of the most impacted by climate change. So just kind of making sure that I understand that their reality is so different and that I'm always mindful of it and that we're always trying to check our biases and make sure that our work is inclusive and in touch with what's really happening on the ground is one of those things that is a touch point for me and for the team that I work with.
That's really cool.
And also really sad at the same time. But yes, it is pretty cool that you guys are actually working so hard to ensure that you do a great job.
Yep. It definitely is. And I like what you said about the data gaps because it is important to remember. I think even when you look at getting data beyond just, metrics about people or finances, things like that, even getting measurements can be difficult. It's already hard in developed nations. In developing nations, it's more of a challenge. Sometimes when you want to compare things, even when you want to get updated satellite images, it can be difficult when you want to get precipitation. Sometimes I have to do models on things like that. And if I'm working or if I'm looking at data in a different country, it's a lot harder than when I'm looking at data here in the US. So I think that's an important challenge that we have to tackle in the environmental space.
Yeah, so thank you so much for highlighting it. Speaking of highlighting, we see that you have been following us on social media, because we kind of stalk our followers. No, we don't. We do a little bit.
You guys, Ashwa stalks you people on social media.
I don't
just want you to
stalk
know.
people. I just want to make sure, I want to get to know the audience. We keep saying we love you guys. If we don't know you, how can we love you? I don't want to be one of those surface level celebrities,
Alexa, play Every Breath You Take by the Police.
Yeah, and that was a love song. So this is love, okay? No, but really, we really appreciate the support. So that means that you're somewhat familiar with what we do, or we're going to assume that you are. Anyway, what has been your favorite episode so far of the Planet Policy Pals show?
Well, you guys have had so many great episodes and interviews with so many cool people, but I think personally, I really liked your global warming and climate change episode, mostly because that's a distinction that's important to me and that I've researched, and also because I was really interested in all the climate change history that Ala was talking about. And I really liked it because
Oh my God.
Why did you do
because I
that?
also like climate change history. So this is like very, very nerdy, but here it is. Here's the truth.
Risham, that means so much to me because Ashwa refuses to acknowledge how wonderful science history is.
What more do you... It's not that I love it, okay? I absolutely love reading about it, or not reading about it. That's why I have you in my life. Yeah, no, it's great that you guys are doing it. Somebody has to. It's just not my thing, but...
No, but climate change history is so bitchy and so petty sometimes, It's just like people are like, you lied, and here's like these climate change deniers that call themselves, like some fancy ass name. And, it's just hilarious. It's like a microcosm of human behavior. I love it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You can really see how human beings tackle the rest of our problems reflected in how we deal with climate change.
Yeah, because it's existential, right? It's existential and it's happening to us. So it's just like such a unique thing.
That's why I have you guys in my life to keep learning about it. So currently, you're working on a project for climate financing in the agriculture sector, right? And given the limited resources in a populated land like Pakistan, and it relies really heavily on agriculture, it's more important than ever to build sustainable systems. We know that for sure. But you also study weather patterns, which of course have a massive impact on farming practices. Pretty significant, I'd say, right? So could you explain the role that climate financing plays in the agriculture sector?
If I could start off with some context on the Pakistan agriculture sector, I feel like that's always helpful when we're trying to contextualize a problem, why it's important, and why we're trying to solve it. I think maybe we can talk about it in terms of people. Pakistan is at the moment somewhere between 230 to 240 million people, so that's 250 million people here. 2/3, 63%, live in rural areas and therefore are in some way employed by the agriculture sector. The agriculture and Pakistan is a primarily agrarian economy. It contributes about 20% to GDP, and that's a low figure because methods of production here are very outdated, very archaic. We don't have large land sizes. In fact, 90% of all our farmers are smallholder farmers, and the definition for that in Pakistan is about 12.5 acres. And most farmers are below that. In fact, our average farm size is somewhere between 5 to 6 acres. So large-scale mechanization not possible here. We've got a problem with feudalism where large farmers are about 10% of all farmers and control almost 50% of the land. So you can see that imbalance. So there's contextually, there's a lot going on. Additionally, I think the IPCC, we are the fifth most vulnerable country to climate change in the world. We contribute less than 1%, I believe it's 0.7% of global emissions. And the IPCC said that in the Pakistan region, if there is a degree of warming, Pakistan would warm almost a whole degree in addition to that 1 degree of warming. So eventually we're going to run out of cultivable land and cultivable growing regions in the country. So I think that climate financing is super important for agriculture in Pakistan because we have very fragmented and broken value chains and supply chains. There's a ton of middlemen. Farmers don't see, I think 20 to 50% of all the food grown is wasted before it can get to like a mandi, which is a wholesale market for fresh fruit and vegetables. Those are massive losses for farmers that are already poor. So we can use climate financing to improve financial inclusion for farmers, to sort of help them and build their capacity when it comes to new growing methods, and also to create policy that is reflective of what they actually need and that is bottom up. And we can use that, especially in Pakistan's case, to build adaptation capacity, because we do not have a mitigation problem, which is what I get very frustrated about when I look at global climate finance discourse, that a lot of it is centered on mitigation, because developed countries have that problem where their emissions are just massive, with some exceptions like China and India, of course. But that's where they kind of want to concentrate financing. That's where things like the Clean Development Mechanism and the Kyoto Protocol mess sort of came about. Not that they didn't have their uses, but adaptation and adaptation climate finance is a big one. And I believe that that is very key for agriculture, because if you are putting climate finance into agriculture, 90% of the time it will have adaptation related outcomes, because energy is only a small portion, or emissions avoided through avoiding food waste is only a small component of the problem.
I think when we talk about the agriculture sector, that's not a way that people look at, like even in Pakistan right now, right? So since you focus on smallholders farmers, what would you say are the biggest threats that need to be addressed to protect their stakes?
I mean, it's hard to come up with like a list of threats. There's some climate threats. There's some like income related threats. I think that climate change, we're already seeing impacts from it in Pakistan. I think UN estimates put losses from floods at $1 billion, a year in Pakistan. I believe that we lost somewhere between $3.4 billion to $10 billion from the locusts. That kind of came and were very, very destructive for farmers in 2020 and 2021. And while that's not a direct climate change impact like drought, it is caused by temperature differentials and changing weather patterns across the world. And it's one of those indirect threats that we're going to see more and more of that we just don't account for. And I think that those are some of the biggest threats for farmers. I think the fact that their incomes are just going to shrink and leave them with further lack of cushion when it comes to insulating themselves from climate shocks is a massive problem. And also, I think in Pakistan specifically, for instance, we don't have cold chain storage and we don't have warehousing models. And that's a value chain play. That's a logistics and a market linkage play that just needs to, now just exist, because we're facing massive amounts of food waste, and we're wasting farmers at the mercy of middlemen, and we're seeing just, our ability to cultivate food sort of like decrease. We've become a food importer for staple crops like wheat, for instance. We imported 1.3 billion tons of wheat in 2020 or 2021. And that's just unacceptable for a country like Pakistan. So those are some of the threats that come to my mind.
Especially given Pakistan's GDP relies a lot on agriculture, and how we are actually we are an agricultural country. So something as basic as wheat wheat was what we used to have in abundance, right? So what happened there?
I believe that the politicization of certain crops, like sugarcane, for instance, needs to be avoided because sugarcane just sucks up water, and Pakistan's heading towards water scarcity. We're going to be the most water scarce country in the region by 2030. That is scary. We cannot afford to be a country that prioritizes water guzzling crops like sugarcane just because they suit the interests of a few. And I know that this is heading into politics, but this is also just a serious policy issue, just given the incentives and subsidies that exist for sugar. So I just think we need to take a good hard look at ourselves in the mirror, and someone needs to I don't know if it's possible, but we need to stop cultivating sugarcane at the scale that we are.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Yes, it's veering into politics, but that's what policy is about, right? It is interesting how you talk about, certain things affect other people more than others, and whose interests are we putting forth when we decide policy, especially when, like you said, income plays a role. And people need to survive, people need to eat, and these smallholder farmers, this is their livelihood, this is their life, but also the food that they create is important to everybody else. Speaking of that food and this inequality, agriculture provides employment for roughly 25 million people in Pakistan. It's the main income source for 34% and 74% of economically active men and women, respectively. Even though they make up the majority of the country's agricultural workforce, right? That's 74% with the women, they are less likely to own income-generating assets. And, of course, they have inadequate access to things like education, technology, and the latest farming techniques. Are there any steps that you have noticed, or any NGOs, any government relief schemes that you're aware of that are taking steps to mitigate this problem to assist these women?
So Pakistan has a problem with gender in general, but especially in the agriculture sector, because rural areas are extremely patriarchal. And while women 100% do make up the majority of the workforce, I believe they put in 12 to 15 hours of unpaid labor on average every day, sometimes more in certain provinces. They are generally not able to own land just because of patriarchal structures at play, because inheritance laws are not actually enforced. So I think that's a big one. And I think until we address some of that, we cannot address women being able to own land, being able to own assets, and being able to make their own financial decisions. That's one thing. I do believe that over time, female inclusion in agriculture programs as farmers, as decision makers, is being emphasized. The government is trying to help by creating general social safety nets in the country, such as the Kisan Guard and the Sehat Guard, just sort of trying to ensure some kind of system at play. But it's very, very slow moving. I think that individuals are doing a lot, individual companies, individual NGOs sometimes. For instance, there's something called Goats for Water or Uptrade, and it helps small off-grid rural communities meet their household needs by using livestock as currency. So because most farmers in Pakistan are also livestock farmers, they will have a few goats, or they will have at least a cow if they're sort of getting things right a little bit and have a little bit of a cushion income-wise. So they help them use their animals as sort of collateral to sort of kind of bridge that gap and use livestock as currency. And they directly work with women and have impacted over 8,000 women. So that's one example of work that's happening. But again, it's very fragmented, it's very regional, but it is happening.
Oh, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, that's some relief to know. Given the gender inequality in this country, we really need to take some massive steps in the right direction. Like you said earlier, Pakistan is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. We have the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank estimate that Pakistan is facing up to $3.8 billion in annual economic loss due to climate change if there's an increase of up to 2.5 degrees Celsius in temperature over the next 2 decades, right? And like you said earlier, every increase in a degree in temperature globally, it's going to be one more for Pakistan, right? So it's even worse. Like they were, 2016, I think they were working with trading carbon credits with the EU, right? And your research has been about climate finance. How do you think Pakistan can mitigate these estimated losses with their investment policies?
Yeah, I think that carbon credit policies have a lot of issues. They haven't been able to solve them even in more evolved markets like the EU, where carbon trading was a big thing, especially post Kyoto. So I don't necessarily see how that would be best for Pakistan, but it's one step. And there's the thing about climate change. One of my professors, who was the climate change advisor to the White House when Barack Obama was president, always used to say, because we would just ask her all these questions. She's like, there's no silver bullet. There's no one answer. And I think that's what I always feel about climate change policies. It takes the private sector, it takes the public sector, and it takes an interdisciplinary approach where you sort of use the strengths of both. I think on the government front, we are trying to develop a national adaptation plan to sort of mainstream adaptation across policies in the country. I think that's a step in the right direction. I think that we have engaged with multilaterals and bilateral DFIs to the extent possible. I feel like we could do better. I think there's definitely capacity issues there. We could definitely be getting more funding into Pakistan. So I think that the Board of Investment, Pakistan's Federal Board of Investment, has identified several priority areas: agriculture and food security, as well as transport and logistics. So that's 2, I believe, out of 5 or 6 that they've identified that are relevant to ag. And they are looking to create opportunities there, whether that's through CPEC and special economic zones, or publicizing investment opportunities and joint venture opportunities in Pakistan on their website, and sort of like trying to create those links between international investors and Pakistani projects. So that's one way they're doing it. I think there's a lot of other things happening as well. I think that the private sector really needs to step up and do its part, because we've been looking at microfinance and financial inclusion, which we really know is one of the key ways that farmers can sort of improve their livelihoods, that can help them access, credit, that can then help them scale up, that can help them, improve their income security. And I believe that private lending to the agriculture sector remains bound between 6 to 9%. And that's very, very low, and that agriculture credit disbursement targets are not met, and they weren't met last year either. So even though we have all this private credit available, it does not get to farmers. It gets to intermediaries. It gets to people who don't necessarily need that credit. So I believe that that's somewhere that the government can really step in and try to make policies that sort of improve digitization and improve farmer inclusion, because only 16% of Pakistani adults have bank accounts. And I believe that that's an average for rural and urban areas, and the situation is even more abysmal in rural areas in terms of financial inclusion. So that's one that really comes to mind for me.
And then also the 10 billion tsunami project, right? Do you think that's also something that has proven to bring a change?
So I believe that it's a mitigation project, and I believe that what it's politicization aside, what it's accomplishing in terms of publicity for climate change, because the Imran Khan government sort of came in on almost a Green Party-esque mandate, where they really wanted to prioritize climate change and conversations about climate change. In that sense, it's doing a good job. It was lauded at COP. Boris Johnson spoke about it at some UN summit. it's out there, and it's inspiring other countries to also take up large scale tree plantation projects. Pakistan's trying to develop some kind of finance for a biodiversity performance bond that could allow it to sort of reduce its debt, as long as it's making contributions towards nature-related activities. And I believe some European countries like the UK and Germany are part of those conversations to sort of see how we could figure that out. So maybe it could be an opportunity to direct more climate finance into the country. And additionally, I just think Pakistan is one of the countries, as the country whose forests are disappearing at the highest rate in the world, it needs projects like this. So I think that in the spirit of what it does, it's important, and in what it actually does, it's also important. We just don't necessarily need mitigation projects like the 10 billion sheet tsunami. Maybe, adaptation related stuff is always so much less sexy. It's like, how did you improve incomes? How did you insulate someone against a climate shock? And how did you build their resilience? And that is just through things like providing them with drought-resistant seed or helping them open a bank account. And it's just not as cool to talk about it.
Very well said. That is a good point. So on episode 40 of this series, we discussed the importance of integrity and accountability in climate mitigation funding and the issues that came up, of course, at the COP26 as a result of developed nations failing to meet the $100 billion USD pledge. The struggle for climate financial availability is a serious one, especially since many developing countries, they're not able to deal with climate impacts that they're already experiencing. And that's why we need something separate for losses and damages, right? Because the funding they have right now doesn't cover that.
Like, we've also discussed funding sources in terms of credits, governments, the GCF on episodes 40 and 41, and corporations. And a lot of these funds, they go towards loss and damage as a result of climate change. And in episode 36, we explained to our audience how many regions, especially in Asia and Africa, are already experiencing destruction due to climate change. What do you think is the next step to increase climate finance availability in developing nations, especially as the effects of loss and damage on agriculture are felt by billions of people?
So I feel like loss and damage is a funny one because it's about impacts from things other than mitigation and adaptation, and that's especially significant for small island nations that are facing very, very immediate impacts. I feel like post-Paris, everyone was a bit sluggish because a lot of these institutions were just getting up to speed, and the concept of climate finance was a bit of a new one, although the GCF was established as a result of Paris. And it does function as one of the only green climate financing institutions in the world. I believe that COP26 was a bit of a wash in terms of that because we didn't meet our target once again. They set up something called the Glasgow Dialogue Forum to sort of discuss how that financing could be accumulated. I think Biden said something along the lines of, yes, we're going to meet our funding targets, but we really need to see how we can raise it and improve how we can raise it. But here we are financing wars just fine. So, it just all feels like lip service, and I feel really disgusted by the fact that the pledges were in the millions and countries were lauded for contributing 1 million euros. And it's like, amazing. Thank you for giving us 1 million euros when the target was 100 million. So, I think it's that classic case of the decision makers not being the ones affected and therefore not really willing to stir themselves. I mean, yes, Europe is seeing temperature increases. Yes, the US is seeing wildfires, but they're not literally sinking into the ocean. They're not literally the fifth most vulnerable country to climate change. They've also not been historically exploited through colonization or slavery or any of that other good stuff. So institutional weakness and problems that exist in developing countries and, definitely lead to compounding problems in them accessing finance and in their capacity to disperse finance. There's just so many dimensions to this. So I don't necessarily have an answer. I just have a tirade.
That's all right.
Yeah.
I think it's also really important for people to remember what you said about, the people who are making the decisions aren't necessarily the ones who are suffering the losses and damages. And I think they've had a long time to correct this problem, they had 12 years to do this, to come up with the money that they pledged to donate, and they didn't. So that's still kind of on them.
Also, the argument is that creating a formal loss and damage fund opens them up to compensation and compensation claims or something like that. I think that's absolutely bullshit, because they're kind of already open to those already. And also, countries like India, I know that they sort of like phased down the coal stuff, the coal language in COP26, but a lot of the onus on sort of mitigating emissions and sort of like having that change is put on developing countries, as well as denying them funds for loss and damage. I just think it's very poor behavior, because they contributed to worldwide emissions. They contributed to anthropogenic, temperature increases. The increases that we're seeing now are not caused by emissions from China within the last 20 years. It's all that coal and all that good stuff that's been happening since 1888 or whatever the date is.
Right. That's a good point. I mean, I still think that the countries that have shifted, like China, India, Brazil, we need to reconstruct a new way to deal with their losses and damages, because it's not the same. I wouldn't put like China's loss and damage at the same as Pakistan's loss and damage, especially since they're now a very high emitter. You know what I mean? But you do make a very good point.
I agree. I think that China, India, Brazil, the BRICS countries are in their own special category, and that's only just. And as we see the sort of shift in global consumption, global demand, sort of driving production in those countries, India is suddenly the largest exporter of shrimp in the world. From 2009, when it didn't really have any kind of seafood exports, to 2021, it is the world's largest exporter of shrimp. They are in their own category just because of the pace of development and the fact that 2 billion people ish live in them collectively is just staggering. So I take your point, Ala.
Yeah.
That was great, you guys. Loved hearing all this. So there's a lot of awareness campaigns, right, Risham, like regarding climate change in Pakistan. So in this community, have you seen this sense of urgency or like emergency being reflected? Or do you think the public still does not perceive the threat to be as dire as it really is?
I think that Pakistanis generally don't. I think that we see some kind of consciousness. There's always a lot in the news. There's always someone writing about it. There's a lot of people doing cool work in recycling or trying to come up with alternative fabrics or things like that. But there's no kind of like massive climate movement in the country. And credit where credit's due, the government that came in definitely prioritized climate change a bit more. I think we started having more climate change conversations. But I think we're swiftly reaching the point, or maybe have reached it, where conversation just isn't going to be enough. And yeah, there's people like me or organizations that are doing work, but I just don't think it's at the pace where it needs to be. I think there was a really interesting quote at COP26 where they were talking about loss and damage funding, but they said, we're moving inches when we need to be moving miles and moving mountains. And, it's kind of scary. So I feel like the conversation just isn't happening. I feel like on a national level, when someone talks to us about, or on an international level where someone talks to us about climate change, we always say we're the most vulnerable. And there's always this deflection, we only emit 0.07 of the world's emissions, it's not really our problem. We just need help. So I don't know how much longer that conversation can keep going on. We need to be deciding our own destinies. But that is the case with developing countries that, whose people don't have enough food, whose people don't have enough education, whose people, are struggling in so many other ways. Climate change just seems like something way, way ahead of us. It doesn't seem like a real problem because day to day we don't see that many changes. And I think that's what's so insidious about it. But we are the most vulnerable. And I think there's one thing I can say for Pakistan, that at least there are no climate change deniers here. It's not institutionalized or politicized to the extent that it is in the US, for instance. So that's one good thing, and maybe that's the note I can end on.
No, that's actually a great point. Yeah, when people are dying on the daily for far more pressing reasons like poverty and hunger and, even these feudal lord issues, there's just so much crime based on that. So yeah, climate change is literally the last of their issues.
It certainly is something to reflect on. So honestly, thank you for coming on here. We really loved having you, Risham. Right, Ajwa?
Yes, of course. It was a lovely chat through and through. Absolutely enjoyed it.
We did. And I think my biggest takeaway from this is it's very interesting to see how no matter what field you are or what your background is, you can find a way to transition to the environment, guys. I think you know how like tech was the last like big frontier everyone jumped to. The way the world is going, I think the environment is where we're gonna see a lot of people moving into. And I think this interview is a very good reflection of that. So thank you, Risham. There's something we like to do when we have the show is we rank whatever we talked about on a scale of 1 to apocalypse coming for this series. So on a scale of 1 to apocalypse coming, where would you rank the current issue with funding green initiatives, especially as it relates to agriculture in Pakistan? One being, you know what, we got this, it's going fine. And, apocalypse being chaos, we're out of food.
Maybe not now, but 5 years from now, apocalypse coming. We're right there. It's the quiet before the storm, you guys. Shit is about to hit the fan.
Fair enough. Okay, guys, so question for all our lovely listeners out there. Tell us, are there any schemes in your own community that supports your smallholder farmers? Because we do love community businesses. We think that they're important, especially smallholder farms. They're good for the environment and they're good for people. We are enjoying the hell out of these interviews, and this is our second to last one on this break. I know this was supposed to be like a 4-week break, then we said a 5-week break. We're stretching it out, guys. Look, we're bringing you content. You can't complain, okay? But don't worry, we're going to still have some more interviews, I think in a month or so after this. Thanks again to our wonderful guest, Risham Amjad. And you can find her on LinkedIn as well if you want to connect. We really appreciate the constant support you guys give us by listening. So please continue to review us, rate us, send us your audience questions. We're still checking our DMs on social. Find us on Twitter, Planet Policy Pal, Instagram, Planet Policy Pals, and like our Facebook page. Anyway, guys, remain awesome. And as always,
Keep learning, pals.